Good evening. I just want to check that everyone can hear me all right, way at the back. Good. My name is Belle Jarneski, and I am the Executive Director of the Jewish Heritage Center. Before we begin tonight, I would like to note that the land on which we are gathering tonight is Treaty 1 land and also the homeland of the Métis Nation. I'm so pleased to welcome you to tonight's program, Jews, Mennonites, and the Holocaust, and it's just wonderful to see such a large crowd here. The genesis of this program came about just about a year ago when I was in Toronto at a conference. Doris Bergen, who is Mennonite, you can tell by the name, holds the chair in Holocaust Studies for the University of Toronto. It's the Rose and Ray Wolf Professor of Holocaust Studies. And she had been the keynote speaker at a groundbreaking conference at Bethel College in Kansas in 2018. And Dr. Bergen noted that we have two of the participants, Dr. Freezin and Werner, right here in Winnipeg. And she said, now wouldn't that make such a wonderful program? And I said, it sure would. And here we are tonight. Well, Bethel provided a wonderful introduction to the subject matter before us tonight, which I'm only too happy to borrow. The history of Mennonites as victims of violence in the 1930s and 1940s, particularly on the territory of the Soviet Union, and as relief workers during and after the Second World War, has been studied by historians and preserved by many family histories. This commemorative and celebratory history, however, hardly captures the full extent of Mennonite views and actions related to nationalism, race, war, and survival. It also ignores extensive Mennonite pockets of sympathy for Nazi ideals of racial purity, and among some in the diaspora, including right here in Manitoba, an exuberant identification with Nazi Germany that have also long been noted. Now, in the last decade, an emerging body of research has documented Mennonite involvement as perpetrators in the Holocaust in ways that have not been widely known or discussed. A wider view of Mennonite interactions with Jews, Germans, Ukrainians, Roma, Volksdeutsche, and other groups, as well as with state actors, is therefore now necessary. So before I go on to have our speakers begin, I'd like to tell you a little more about the Jewish Heritage Center. I'm sure that most of you know that our mandate is to collect and preserve the records, artifacts, and traditions of our community. But did you know that our collection includes, among so much more than 70,000 photographs from the 1870s until today, more than 1,300 sound and image recordings, more than 200 bound volumes of newspapers from 1914 to the present, and that includes Yiddish and English, more than 4,000 artifacts, including religious paraphernalia, medical and pharmaceutical items, military jackets, pins and awards, clothing, dolls, trophies, sports memorabilia, and more. The center also serves as an advocate for anti-racism and education on the Holocaust and anti-Semitism to thousands of students each year. More and more, the Jewish Heritage Center finds itself in demand as the principal purveyor of Holocaust education in the province. Please save May 13th on your calendar for our annual fundraising event, the Saul and Florence Caney Distinguished Lecture. This year, we are proud to feature eminent scholar and author Daniel Gordis. The title of his talk will be 2048, Will Israel Survive Until Its 100th Birthday? But coming up much sooner is our very exciting exhibition celebrating 100 years of the YMHA, and opening night is December 5th. Now it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's presenters. Dr. Ilene Freezin is an assistant professor and the co-director of the Center for Transnational Mennonite Studies at the University of Winnipeg, as well as the executive director of the Plett Foundation. Her first book, Colonizing Russia's Promised Land, Orthodoxy and Community on the Siberian Steppe, will be out next year with the University of Toronto Press. She has published on a variety of topics related to the history of the Mennonites in the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, and recently received a grant from the Social Sciences Research Council of Canada for a project exploring the mobility of Mennonites into, through, and out of the Russian Empire. The title of Dr. Freezin's talk tonight will be The Experiences of Jews and Mennonites in Khortytsia, Zaporizhia, forgive my pronunciation.
Zaporozhye.
Thank you. Under German occupation. Recently retired from his position as professor and executive director of the D.F. Platt Historical Research Foundation of the University of Winnipeg, Dr. Hans Werner has had a long and distinguished career in history and Mennonite studies. His dissertation examined the integration of Mennonite and other Protestant immigrants who came to Winnipeg from the Soviet Union via Germany in the 1950s, and those who came to Bielefeld, Germany in the 1970s and 80s. Dr. Werner is the author of many publications, including The Constructed Mennonite, History, Memory, and the Second World War, and also Imagined Homes, Soviet-German Immigrants in Two Cities. Dr. Werner's talk tonight is entitled A Usable Past, Soviet Mennonite Memories of the Holocaust. And so now it is my pleasure to call on Dr. Freezin to begin.
Thank you, and thank you to the Jewish Heritage Center for the invitation to speak to you this evening. In the spring of 1942, at the end of March or the beginning of April, the last major massacre of Jews in military-occupied eastern Ukraine occurred. By the order of the German authorities, the Jewish population gathered under the pretense that they would be relocated for work. One eyewitness described a chaotic scene as the remaining Jewish population congregated and began a long march under armed guards. Most walked, while the sick, elderly, and young children were transported by trucks. Leonid Lerner, who escaped from the scene, remembered how he marched with his family, including his mother, grandmother, brother, and cousins through Zaporozhye, carrying suitcases. His family had been preparing to celebrate Passover when they were rounded up. After they arrived at the outskirts of the city, they were led to an anti-tank ditch, told to remove their clothing, and then they were shot. The shooting began at 8 in the morning and ended in the evening. By the end, approximately 3,000 Jews had been murdered, their bodies carelessly covered with dirt, and when the spring rains came, they began to wash away. Soon after this event, Mennonites gathered across the Dnieper River in their church in Khortytsia on Easter Sunday to celebrate the risen Christ for the first time in nearly a decade. Converted into an old movie theater under the Soviet regime, this church had been cleared of Stalin's portraits and reopened as a place of worship soon after the start of German occupation. Gerhard Fast, a German citizen with Mennonite roots in Russia, who had been assigned to gather information on the ethnic Germans, or Volksdeutsche, in the region, attended the service. He described how the celebration began with a full church singing, "Christ is risen, tell it to Zion," and included prayer, a scripture reading, and a sermon. These images demonstrate in stark terms how the new regime elevated Mennonites and committed violence against Jews as it imposed its racial hierarchy. Mennonites benefited materially, socially, and culturally, albeit briefly, from being categorized as ethnic Germans, while Jews were subjected to unspeakable violence. Even though the massacre did not happen close to the church, it is not hard to imagine that rumors of the event had drifted from across the river, especially as, according to Anna Suderman, 50 members of Jewish families from Khortytsia, a number of whom had lived in the town for their entire lives, had previously been taken to the outskirts of the town and executed. Some scholars have characterized Mennonites during the Second World War as being caught between two ruthless regimes, the Nazis and the Soviets. Well, that might describe a portion of the population who knew what was happening but turned a blind eye out of fear, indifference, fatigue, or ideological sympathy. Tonight, I will speak primarily on local collaboration with German occupying forces with a focus on those who were involved in perpetrating violence against the Jewish community. German officials relied on members of the local population to hold administrative and leadership positions under occupation. Men of Mennonite backgrounds entered into these positions, becoming mayors, district administrators, translators, some women also served in that particular role, and police officers for the occupying regime. With knowledge of Russian and German, their useful language skills along with their ethnic backgrounds made them into prime candidates for these positions. For instance, shortly after the occupation of Zaporizhia, German officials appointed Heinrich Wiebe, who was born in 1889, as mayor of Old Zaporizhia until the fall of 1942 when he was replaced. In New Zaporizhia, the regime installed Isaac Reimer, born in 1898, as the mayor. According to the memoir of one of his contemporaries, Johann Rempel, Reimer had shown a vicious streak in this position, pointing the finger at two Mennonites as former Soviet informants, and these men were quickly executed. Rempel added that it was unclear whether local Mennonites or the occupying forces carried out the execution. In the case of Hortitza, a recent returnee from the Gulag, Johann or Hans Epp, born in 1898, was appointed as the mayor and would quickly become a district administrator. The appointment of local men helped to secure these positions from outsiders. For instance, soon after German forces established control, representatives of Western Ukrainian nationalist organizations arrived in Zaporizhia hoping to gain a foothold in the local administration, which they were prevented by doing so because of the installment of Mennonites. Scholars have struggled with the theme of collaboration by the local population under occupation during the Second World War, searching for patterns in behavior and debating the influence of ideology and pragmatism in the motivations of individuals. Often overlooked in these discussions is the issue of age or membership in a generational cohort. While Mennonite mayors of a variety of ages worked for the occupying regime, the similarity in ages of these three men working in and near Zaporizhia is striking. As young men, they had witnessed the fall of the Romanov dynasty, the chaos of the Civil War, and the implosion of the Mennonite Commonwealth caused by the Bolshevik Revolution. These men could remember the old country of Tsarist Russia, as well as the Mennonite religious and cultural traditions that had sustained the community for over a century in Russia. The background of Heinrich Wiebe, who was the mayor of Old Zaporizhia, provides an example of how some members of this cohort learned to navigate their environment, employing a flexible ideology which allowed them to exploit opportunities and sidestep peril. Born in the southeastern corner of the Molochna colony in the village of Steinfeld, Wiebe was well educated, attending the Orlov Secondary School and the Helpstadt Teacher College, before joining a small contingent of Mennonites studying in the imperial capital of St. Petersburg. These Mennonite men and women, socialized extensively with each other in St. Petersburg, sometimes gathering for Bible study in the evening. Wiebe stayed in St. Petersburg until shortly after the Bolshevik Revolution, when he returned to the Molochna colony, joining the administration in the district village of Gnadenfeld. During this period of social and political upheaval, Wiebe demonstrated a shrewdness combined with a predilection for leadership, exploiting difficulties between the Bolsheviks and Nestor Makhno's men for the benefits of Mennonites. Under the Soviet regime, he managed, unlike many other educated Mennonites, to avoid being arrested, although he did resign from a teaching position in Hortitza with the understanding that he would be dismissed if he stayed. He reinvented himself as a bookkeeper in Zaporizhia, a position he maintained until the arrival of the German army. Wiebe, as he had done in the past, adapted quickly to his new circumstances. An early report from the German military hints at how Wiebe presented his past to the new German regime. Field Commander Keeling reported that Wiebe had been a long-time administrator in the local government during the Tsarist period, neglecting to mention his administrative experience under the early Bolshevik regime. This was not surprising, as communist officials were quickly hunted and executed by the Germans. Weeb presented himself as a gentleman who was both capable and ideologically reliable. For instance, on his trip to Zaporizhia in early 1942, Karl Stumpf, who was conducting research into ethnic Germans in the region, described Weeb as, quote, sitting in dignity on his official leather chair. Above him hung a large portrait of the Fuhrer, end of quote. Stumpf gifted this, quote, intelligent official of the old type, end of quote, a copy of Mein Kampf, which Weeb happily received. Ultimately, Weeb would retreat with the German army in 1943, eventually arriving in Canada with his wife. Mennonite men not only entered into the administrative hierarchy, they also joined the security organs of the occupying forces. Two significant local organs of direct violence under occupation were the auxiliary police and the security service, also known as the SD, the latter of which was involved in tracking down and interrogating suspicious elements in their search for communist Jews and partisans. Ethnic Germans were recruited into helping both organizations. However, other ethnicities, including Ukrainians, were also well represented. In the case of Zaporizhia, likely the majority of the members of these organizations were Ukrainians, followed by ethnic Germans, which included Mennonites and non-Mennonites. Initially, after German occupation, a Ukrainian man led the auxiliary police of Old Zaporizhia, consisting of 50 men, and a Russian occupied a similar position in New Zaporizhia, leading 120 men. Ethnic Germans, however, soon were inserted into key positions, with Ivan Fast serving as the head of the auxiliary police and his older brother Jacob Fast as an important figure in the political department of the security service. Soviet interrogations conducted after the war provide insight into the process by which men became involved in the auxiliary police and the security service in Zaporizhia. Friends, colleagues, and acquaintances already working for the police often facilitated and encouraged an applicant to join the ranks. According to his interrogation records, Stefan Fomenko joined the police soon after learning about the job from Ivan Fast. Fomenko confided to Fast that he was looking for work, and Fast, a longtime acquaintance from the agricultural machinery factory Kommunar, who was already working as the head of the police, invited him to apply for a position. A number of the local men who decided to work for the Germans appeared to have originated from this factory, illustrating how employment connections served as a recruitment tool. Fast's welcoming of non-ethnic Germans into the ranks also demonstrates that Mennonites had acclimatized to at least some elements of Soviet nationality policy, which promoted a sense of camaraderie among different national groups. Scholarly work on the formation of police units in Ukraine shows that these initial recruits in October of 1941 were voluntary. It was not until the summer of 1942 that Germans relied on compulsion to fill the ranks of the local police. Fomenko would work for the first few months as part of the police until mid-January 1942, when he joined the political department of the security service. Vladimir Irsak, of Czech nationality, also followed this career path, moving from the auxiliary police to the political department of the security service. Irsak had worked at Kommunal, the factory, from 1934 until the beginning of the Second World War. In 1936, he had also joined the Communist Party, working in the Komsomol. During his interrogation by Soviet officials, he stated that he had joined the police voluntarily after running into one of his colleagues, who emphasized that Irsak's communist past put him at risk and encouraged him to join the police and gave him advice on how to apply. Irsak submitted his application to Ivan Fast and started working for the police soon afterwards. While these two men, Fomenko and Irsak, were not Mennonite, their circumstances point to non-ideological reasons for joining the police. Instead of a group of impetuous young men, the evidence points to the presence of mature local men with roots in the community as helping the security service. For instance, Jacob Fast, who headed up the political department of the security service, was a father and a husband and a father of four in his early 30s when the occupation started. Although growing up, his family had been on the margins of the Mennonite community, according to the memoirs of his aunt's wife, Anna Suderman, he had married into a family that was part of the Mennonite pillar. His wife, Natalie Fast, who was a baptized member of the Hortitsa Mennonite Church, was also the daughter of one of the last ministers of Hortitsa, Aaron Taves. As the Soviet state persecuted religious communities and their leaders, Taves remained steadfast in his commitment to the church, continuing to offer spiritual comfort to those in need. Unlike Jacob Fast's own father, who survived the terror of the 1930s, Taves was arrested in 1934, interrogated, and given a sentence of 5 years. Soviet officials accused him of anti-Soviet agitation, including providing the addresses of fascist organizations to people for receiving help and of writing provocative letters to people abroad. These trumped-up charges were based on Taves' activities during the early 1930s as he tried to help ministers and others get in touch with Mennonite aid organizations abroad to help during a period of repression and famine. He would never be reunited with his family, although he communicated extensively with them, sending biblically inspired reflections. These communications would stop, and as the files, his interrogation files from the KGB archives show, he was actually executed in 1937. Without Taves' leadership, as the Soviets anticipated, the Hortisa Mennonite Church closed soon after his arrest. After the marriage of Jacob and Natalie Fast, Jacob spent a significant amount of time away from home working as a truck driver. The family lived in Hortisa until Fast began working for the security service at the outset of occupation when they moved to Zaporizhia. He volunteered for that role only a week after the German army had established its control over the city. We know this information because it's included in his records produced by the Nazi regime as ethnic Germans were being resettled, also known as the EWZ records. In these records, we can confirm that Jacob served in the security service, and we also can find that he listed his religion as Mennonite. Anna Suderman, who many people have used her memoirs to shed light on this period and have reflected on how she has written with candor about this period, never mentions the activities of her niece's husband during this time. The Fast family lived in Zaporizhia until they left with the retreating German army in 1943. Natalie remembered the moment with melancholy as the departing families boarded packed trains singing, "God be with you until we meet again." With help from Mennonite Central Committee, the Fast family would make their way to Canada in the summer of 1947, having spent time in a camp for displaced people in Hanover. In 2007, the Canadian government revoked Fast's citizenship for concealing his wartime activities. Fast would pass away before his deportation to Ukraine could take place. I'm sure many of you are wondering if there is concrete evidence showing the participation of Mennonites in violence against Jews. Recent scholarship exploring the role of local administrators, such as mayors, has concluded that their labor was significant in implementing German racialized policies. In the case of Wiebe, his official reports, the reports that he wrote himself, showed that Zaporizhia relied on the confiscation of Jewish property to fund its local budget, and that identifying and registering the local Jewish population was one of his duties, as it would have been for other Mennonite mayors in places with Jewish populations. As for the Sapodilla Massacre, Wiebe claimed that he was in the hospital when the Jewish population was killed and therefore did not have to witness the event. Extraordinarily, Cornelius Kron, a Mennonite historian, interviewed Heinrich Wiebe in the mid-1950s in Canada. During this exchange, Wiebe had this to say about the massacre. "The Jewish question is a terrible topic. The question is so terrible that the entire Russian population recoiled, and even the Russian GPU, or the secret police, was not as terrible as the German Gestapo. The Jews were brought together on the square and shot in broad daylight. If any child was alive, a dog was set on it. The dog grabbed the child and tore it apart." In this post-war interview, Wiebe readily offered his own location during the event. He was in the hospital. However, he failed to mention the people responsible for carrying out this atrocity. As mayor of Zaporizhia, Wiebe actually had included this information in his official report for March 1942, which I managed to find when I was working in the Zaporizhia archives. And in this report, he noted that the local police, so the Zaporizhia local police, had taken part in this action against the Jewish population. He provided no additional information Unlike the head of the auxiliary police, which was one of the Fast brothers, I don't know which, I'm assuming it was Yvonne Fast, but it just says Fast in a signature, so I can't say for certain, but who wrote in his official report in April, quote, "The Jewish question has been resolved completely, and the masses are in no doubt of its interpretation," end of quote. And I just want to note that instead of using the correct term, the correct Russian word for Jewish, he used a derogatory slur to mark the destruction of this group. Alexander Rempel, a Mennonite scholar and Soviet emigre, claimed to have personally witnessed Mennonite members of the local police, whom he had known from childhood, celebrating the end of Zaporizhia's Jewish population in the spring of 1942. According to Rempel, after the war, Mennonite men hid behind the facade of naivety as they did not want to admit to their crimes, to their families, and to their community. While Rempel's accusations have been known for decades, they have been dismissed on the basis of other nonsensical claims in this particular document that he had written. Brutalized by the Soviet regime, Rempel struggled with his mental health after the war. However, if we start to look and piece together Rempel's life, we can see that he was actually in the town of Anlanga, close to Zaporizhia, briefly during the spring of 1942. After serving as a translator in the German army, he applied to leave his position, a request which was approved on the 8th of March, 1942. He traveled home to his family before leaving for Germany sometime in April of that year. According to this timeline, he was present in the region when the remaining Jewish population was executed. Even without Rempel's account, the report of Wiebe confirms that members of the local police force participated in the massacre. This implicates Mennonite men who served in the local police and in the security service as performing a role in the process by which Jewish families were rounded up, herded, and executed. According to Soviet interrogation records, in the days leading up to the event, locals working for the security service had been active in identifying Jews. These men knew that an execution was on the horizon. Vladimir Ersak described the following in his interrogation after the war. Quote, "At the end of March, all the employees of the security service political department were given the task of identifying Jews in Zaporizhia. I personally received such an order from the secretary of the political department, Kornis Andres." And I'm just going to add something, an aside, that this Andres has been described by other people as a German who was born in Hortica, who was particularly cruel in his interrogation techniques and was an active shooter, although I have to say that the source doesn't tell whether he was an active shooter in the massacre of Jews or whether he was a shooter in the massacre of Soviet POWs, which also occurred at the same location, but in different periods. According to some other sources, he would later join the SS. So now back to Ersak's words. "We knew that the mass shooting of Jews was coming. I find it difficult to remember the number executed, but there were more than 1,000. On the day of execution, a column of Jews were taken out of the courtyard of the political department to the place of execution. In each row of the column, there were 10 people. The Jews were shot by officers of an SS team. On this day, from the local police officers, the chief of police, Ivan Fast, took part in the executions. He shot up to 20 people. I, along with other political department workers, escorted the Jews to the place of execution and cordoned it off." So admittedly, this all comes from interrogations that were conducted after the war by Soviet officials, and admittedly we have to read these types of sources with caution, and if anyone wants to ask a question about how I read these sources, I'm happy to answer that. However, from these interrogation records, which are available at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, we see the Fast brothers identified a number of times, along with other Mennonite men, or men with Mennonite last names. We can't confirm their religious or ethnic identity without further information, but men with names such as Kron, there were a number of Thiessens, Dix, Kasdorfs, and others. As Soviet troops reoccupied the territory of Zaporizhia and Hortica in late 1943, they discovered a ransacked land and a decimated population. Once a thriving multi-ethnic region, two of its historic minority groups were now missing. Gathered by the retreating German army, Mennonites and other ethnic Germans had been evacuated eastward. As Jewish Red Army soldiers returned to the area, they found that their families and communities had disappeared. As Pavel Elkinson remembered, quote, "I did not know anything about what happened to my parents. I only knew that they stayed in Zaporizhia, and I knew what the Germans did to the Jews. I assumed the worst. My fears were proved true." Elkinson's father, mother, uncle, aunt, grandmother, and brother lay in the mass grave outside of Zaporizhia. Only his Russian sister-in-law and the family home remained. Mennonites were members and leaders of a multi-ethnic local police and security service that aided the German forces in the perpetuation of this violence. Although further research is required, the examples of Heinrich Wiebe and Jacob Fast show that collaborators were indeed connected to and embedded within the Mennonite community.
Thank you so much. We will be taking questions and answers once Dr. Werner has made his presentation, and I'm pleased to call on him right now.
Thank you very much for having us here today. A usable past, Soviet Mennonite memories of the Holocaust. On June the 22nd, 1941, Hitler unleashed a massive assault on the Soviet Union, and within a few weeks, German armies arrived in the core Mennonite areas of the Khortytsa Old Colony, near the present-day Ukrainian city of Zaporizhia. By October 1941, both the Molochna and Khortytsa colonies were under German occupation. For those Mennonites who had been able to avoid evacuation to the east before the advancing German armies, living under German authority was a tremendous relief from unrelenting Stalinist oppression. By 1941, Soviet Mennonites, originally of Dutch origin, believed themselves to be German and were viewed as such by their German occupiers. As members of the preferred Nazi Aryan race, they were immediately raised above their Slavic neighbors, economically and socially. In spite of Nazi ambivalence and later outright opposition to the resumption of Mennonite religious life, churches were reopened, and even though the highly anticipated restoration of private ownership was often not realized, Mennonites were euphoric in their embrace of what had befallen them. For their Jewish neighbors, the German attack and rapid advance into Soviet territory led to a hurried attempt to stay ahead of German armies in a desperate attempt to escape to the east. For those unable to escape, it meant forced labor and ultimately death. Jews were rounded up and shot in large numbers and buried, often in trenches dug earlier to delay the advance of German tanks. The Einsatzgruppen that sought them out proceeded relentlessly, and extermination of all the remaining Jews in the old colony Mennonite area was achieved in a relatively short period of time. While Mennonites have generally assumed that as a people they did not participate in the annihilation of Jews and knew little about it, research has amply demonstrated that persons of Mennonite origins were actors in the full range of roles in the Holocaust as it unfolded in southern Ukraine. Some Mennonites were perpetrators, collaborators, occasionally rescuers, bystanders, but undeniably aware of the fate that was overtaking their Jewish neighbors. The focus of this presentation is the memories of the largest group of Mennonites, Mennonite actors, namely those who likely had no direct part in the killing of the Jews, but certainly had first-hand knowledge of what was happening. As the generation that experienced the events of World War II gradually fades from the stage, the number of memoirs and life writings of Mennonites who experienced these events is likely also at a zenith. Many of the Soviet Mennonite survivors of the war migrated to Canada or to Paraguay and then Canada, and have written their memoirs in English or had them translated. The migration to Germany of persons of Mennonite origin after the collapse of the Soviet Union have produced additional life writings in German. The dramatic nature of the experiences of World War II and the aging of survivors has also resulted in a, quote, need to tell the stories for succeeding generations, as most of these writings are self-published, often for a family audience. In this presentation, my aim is to use these life writings with an eye to understanding some of the dynamics of remembering and accounting for what Mennonites in the Zaporizhia area knew of the killing of the Jews. Although the themes of suffering, displacement, loss of possessions during the Soviet era, and ultimately the loss of their Ukrainian homeland figured prominently in these memoirs, accounts of witnessing and having knowledge of Nazi atrocities make cameo appearance in almost all of the writings of Soviet Mennonites. How did Mennonites construct their memories? And how were their narratives shaped in the immediate aftermath of the war, or after immigration to Canada in the 1950s, or to Germany in the 1990s? And how did they give these memories meaning? The frameworks used to make the memories of the Holocaust usable can be grouped into four general narrative categories. Mennonites who write extensively about the Soviet period, but nothing about the Holocaust. Secondly, what I would call oppositional narratives. Writers who condemn Nazi atrocities consistently and attempt no justification for them. I will not be dealing with these in this presentation, other than to say that these memoirs are primarily by Mennonite women who married Ukrainians or whose partners were executed by the German occupation forces or the Gestapo. 3, narratives that attempt to give words to the emotions they felt when they saw or unequivocally knew that Jews whom they knew personally were being executed. The memories and words used to tell this aspect of the story fit more clearly into the realm of trauma memories, and writers seem to feel the need to say something, but are less able to make sense or give meaning to what they knew and felt. And fourthly, memories constructed to in some ways, quote, alleviate the sense of guilt that may have attached to an earlier understanding of the same experience, end of quote, as Jeffrey Cubitt puts it, because of the overwhelming sense that the arrival of the German armies had saved them. Broadly, these narratives also include, or are told alongside, stories that portray the Wehrmacht as innocent, the SS and other Nazi organizations culpable, and often makes a case for equal judgment to be meted out to Western allies and the Soviet Union for their atrocities, such as the Gulag or the bombing of Dresden. So I'm going to focus today on primarily the last two of these. There are writers that make no reference to the fate of their Jewish neighbors in their memoirs. Those whose memories could shed particular light on perpetrators and provide insight into their motives and justification have generally not recorded their memories. One notable exception is the minister Gerhard Fast, who Ilene referred to, who was part of the Sturmkommando that was charged with documenting the state of ethnic Germans in occupied territories, including Mennonites. Fast mentions only that there had been 402 Jews in the village of Chortica, and that a Nazi functionary had labeled Mennonites as, quote, white Jews. There are, of course, others who one suspects must have known, who simply avoid the subject in their stories. However, the bulk of memoir literature is written by those who were truly bystanders, largely because of the accident of age and to some extent gender. In 1942, the women writers in my sample of memoirs ranged in age from 11 to 25. While the oldest male writer was already a father in 1942, most male writers were teenagers or 10 or 11 years old. Writers who are recalling from their childhood face fewer moral dilemmas associated with their memories. However, they too seek to make sense of what they remember and attempt to place what they knew about into some kind of a usable understanding of what it meant. While the Mennonite mention of Nazi treatment of Jews was often placed in the larger frameworks of ideology, the creation and labeling of enemies during wartime, and the general horrors of war, authors struggled to give meaning to the death of innocent children and those instances where they saw, as opposed to heard about, the killing of Jews. As Jeffrey Cubitt suggests, traumatic experiences can produce a genuine and perhaps enduring crisis in the organization of biographical remembering. Knowing, or being told, that innocent Jewish children were being poisoned was traumatic, and recalling those memories was disruptive in the overall attempt to create a coherent autobiographical narrative. Given the young age of many of the memoirists, their knowledge of what was happening came either directly from their parents or what they overheard at home and in the village. Wilhelm Jansen and his childhood friends, quote, discussed the terrible fate of the Jews, which we heard about from our parents and relatives as they climbed the trees in the orchard in the village. The most poignant recollections were about hearing about the death of poisoning of Jewish children. Waldemar Jansen recalls his mother telling him when he was 10 or 11 that, quote, Jewish children were being put to death by putting, quote, a little bit of poison on their lips, and that they died quite painlessly. Jacob Brown heard of a Mennonite woman in a neighboring town who had married a Jewish man. Since he was Jewish, he had fled east, leaving his wife and small child behind. When the Germans found out this child had a Jewish father, they took him from his mother and poisoned him. The memories of Mennonites who observed or had direct knowledge of the killing of Jews consistently expressed their horror and shock. As adults writing years later, memories of what they came to know remained with them, but they tend to make sense of the memory on a very personal level, avoiding the larger questions of genocide. In Jacob Brown's account of him joining women he was working with to go see the trench where the bodies of Jews from their village that had been shot, he stopped short because it was, quote, too awful to describe any further details. He could not forget the scene and could not understand how good the Germans were to us while killing others, but we couldn't do anything about it. Most poignantly, the death of Jewish children left Mennonites, often children at the time, with only the deep emotional knowledge of something they could not forget. Once they knew, they could not unknow. Waldemar Jansen could not understand why his mother had told him about the poisoning of children. He suggests personal motives, such as her, quote, as her being, quote, so shocked that she had to express it to someone, or possibly her believing it to be better that he hear it from her rather than from others. Jansen expresses surprise that the news did not affect him more. He cannot remember being very upset or thinking about it further, and attributes his ambivalence to having learned to live with countless stories where such things happened. Why should I be shocked by one more story of death? Ilene Rempel remembers seeing Vera, a Ukrainian or Russian woman in her village, walk by her school window holding an infant. Vera had married a Jew and had made the difficult decision to die together with her husband and children. In Rempel's memoir, she comments that, quote, knowing what happened to Vera made a deep impression on me to this very day. Adults could also not come to terms with the death of children. In what appears to be the telling of the same story of the Russian mother Vera, John Sawatsky could not shake the image of watching his children play with childhood innocence, while Jewish children as innocent as mine, were dying. The most prevalent story Mennonites told themselves and others placed the extermination of the Jews into the same category as the experience of their own people during collectivization, dekulakization, and the purges. Steve Stern's study of memory in Pinochet's Chile posits the notion of memory as salvation. Although Stern acknowledges that it made his blood boil, he argues that for some Chileans, the disappearances and deaths during the Pinochet regime were contextualized as a modest social cost that had to be paid to repair the ruin created by the Chilean left. Similarly, for Soviet Mennonites, Hitler's attack on the Soviet Union became their salvation. And their memories fit neatly into Cold War logic that equated Stalinism and Hitlerism, and offered a way to reconcile the events that seem in a later context to be unconscionable. Otto Clausen, who was 15 in 1942, oscillates between sympathetic memories of the plight of Jews and detailed descriptions of Stalin's atrocities and those of the Allies. His elaborate comparisons imply an equivalence between the killing of the Jews and other historical and wartime tragedies. Clausen notes that his aunt conducted a Jewish choir and relates how a woman had advised him that the German unit stationed in their village was a special SS unit whose mission was to exterminate all the Jews that had not been able to stay ahead of the advancing German army. She told them they had rounded up Jews on the island of Khortytsa and had shot them, and forced Soviet prisoners of war to bury them. She also confided him that she was Jewish, and asked him to keep it a secret, which he did. However, Clausen also invested considerable research and devotes a considerable portion of his memoirs to condemn the actions of the victors of the war. He raises a litany of comparisons. Nazi enslavement of Slavic peoples is set against Stalin's enslavement of Mennonites. The enslavement of Africans in the United States and colonialism in general. Nazi concentration camps, he argues, were preceded by their use by the British during the Boer War, while the Bolsheviks developed their own in the gulags. The victors, Clausen concludes, have no moral right to pass judgment on an entire people. Victor Jansen, an immigrant to Canada via Paraguay, exploits the commonly held view that the Holocaust was carried out by the Nazi Party and the SS, and exempts the German army from complicity. Jansen recalls their collective horror when, quote, regardless of the kind of life they had led before, all Jews were ruthlessly brought together and shot. He notes, however, it was wartime, human life was not worth a lot, and we had experienced enough mass murder in the last decades. Although they were shocked when they realized that the Germans were capable of such atrocities, he notes that the Holocaust was conducted by the Einsatzkommandos and the SD, the Sicherheitsdienst, not the army. Jansen cut short his memories, suggesting, about this I do not need to write more because the topic has been dealt with enough. There have been enough documentaries and the criminals of that time are still being hunted. A survivor of both the war and the Gulag conveys the sense of memory as salvation most explicitly. Peter Sawatsky emigrated to Germany after the fall of the wall, and while on a visit to Canada in 1989, dictated his life story using only his memories. In his brother's translation, Sawatsky laments the beginning of the occupation when the Germans, quote, started their reign by first shooting all the Jews, women, children, men, and old men, and is left only with questions about why innocent people had to die in this way. Sawatsky also explains away the Holocaust by alluding to the common arguments of Bolshevism being a Jewish plot. He tells the story of a Jewish rabbi who he overheard telling his mother, "This Hitler will punish our Jewish people for what we are doing here." A much larger section of his memoir is devoted to the atrocities committed by Stalin and his henchmen. And here he uses Stuart Kahan's Wolf of the Kremlin extensively and concludes, if there had been no Stalin, there would have been no Hitler. The clearest intersection of collective and individual memories as they emerge in these memoirs is embodied in the sense of the Germans and Hitler as having saved Soviet Mennonites from a godless and merciless regime bent on destroying them. Narrators sought to make sense of the autobiographic disruptions that memories of the killing of the Jews produced by distancing themselves from the memories of what they knew. Mennonites viewed the arrival of Germans as signaling the end of arrests, exile, execution, and the constant pressure that sought to both destroy their faith and sense of peoplehood. Initially, the euphoria of having finally escaped the yoke of Stalin is remembered fondly and framed as being justified. Memories of the arrival of Germans also brought with them unanticipated tensions. As the German occupation took hold, Mennonites came to realize that there were significant dark sides to their saviors. Sifting through the memoirs used here suggests that the experience of being saved from Stalin made a reframing of the memory of atrocities committed by the German occupiers almost impossible. Mennonites grasped for other narratives. Rather than confronting the reality of the Holocaust and their various levels of complicity and knowledge of its horrors, the collective memory that emerged equated or even elevated the trauma they had experienced at the hand of the Bolsheviks in comparison to the atrocities committed by the Germans. In that sense, they made their own Soviet experience into a Holocaust that became a usable past, even when they emigrated to Western societies where the collective memory of the destruction of the Jews continued to have widespread potency. Thank you.
Well, how fortunate we are tonight to have had these two brilliant scholars present us with these very important topics. I'd like to call on our chair of the Programs and Exhibits Committee, Dr. Dan Stone, who will thank the speakers.
In an academic panel, At this point, I would begin to summarize, critique, and find ways to criticize the papers. Luckily, this is not an academic panel. That's not my task, and I wouldn't do very well at it because these are two extremely fine papers. This whole event, I think, is very moving and very exciting. It's terrific to see a community, in this case the Mennonite community, looking at its past critically, not harshly, but giving praise where it deserves and giving blame where it deserves. Communities are composed of individuals. They're also composed of individuals with different kinds of links. So it makes it extremely difficult to figure out exactly what's going on and why it's going on. And in order to do that, you have to face the past directly, honestly, and look at it very closely. And that's what Professors Freezin and Werner have done here. I'm particularly interested in the local approach where Professor Freezin, for example, takes a look at the specific individuals, looking at the sources that are available to try to figure out who they are, why they're doing what they're doing, and specifically what they're doing. Where sometime in the past, especially outsiders would give loose generalizations about Mennonites in particular, Mennonites in general in these situations. She has taken a look at this one did this, that one did that. As far as we can figure out, this is why, and you begin to build up a picture. And from a different point of view, Professor Werner is looking at the way it is interpreted. Memory is a very tricky thing, and it gets particularly difficult. Historians are always pressed to look at first-person narratives, written sources, first-person narratives and written sources when possible, first-person narratives in oral sources, sometimes given shortly after the event, sometimes given decades after the event, and trying to put together coherent pictures out of it. So I think here we've seen several different things. For me, one is a community of historians coming to see what actually happened without fear of what they're going to find, and coming up with concrete answers. And then we have these two specific examinations of what was going on in one place at what time, and as far as possible, the individuals who were involved. And the other, what did you make of it afterwards? Why do you remember what you do? Why do you say what it is what you do? So I thank very much the speakers. I thank the organizers, of whom I was one at the very end, not at the very beginning. So I think I have a right to thank the people who put this together, especially Bill Czarniewski, and thank the audience for coming and listening so attentively. Now we do have some time for questions or comments. If your comments, please keep them short. I'm sure that Professors Freezin and Werner will be happy to answer your questions or to listen to your comments. Stan Carbone, the Director of Programs and Exhibits here at the Jewish Heritage Center, has a traveling microphone so we can all hear it. So please.
Perhaps we could call Dr. Freezin and Werner up to the front to make it easier to...
Thank you.
First, I enjoyed Dr. Freezin and Dr. Werner's presentation. I have two questions. Seeing I've never heard of Sapodilla or Disco before, could you tell us where they're geographically located, more or less, near a city that I've heard of? I've heard of many of them. Secondly, can you give us an idea of the Mennonite, Jewish, and general populations of these cities, towns?
So the Mennonite colonies were along the Dnieper River, at the Dnieper Bend. Zaporizhia is sort of presently a larger city. It's south of what was called Dnepropetrovsk, or now Dnipro. That's sort of generally where it is. It's on the, now let me always get this wrong, it's on the right bank of the Dnieper, primarily the colonies. The Molochna colony was on the left bank, or not right on the bank, but on the left side. I don't have off the top of my head the population, but it always sort of sticks in my mind that in the Stumpkommando data that they collected, they got mayors of individual villages to write down all kinds of things about them, about the state of the village before 1941 and so on. And I think one of the largest Mennonites village was Khortytsa, and before 1941, or before the German attack on the Soviet Union, there were 402 Jews in Khortytsa. The Stumpkommando was able to report in 1942 that there were none.
But how many Mennonites and how many ethnic Ukrainians?
So there were considerable ethnic Ukrainians in Khortytsa and in many of the other villages by 1940. I don't know. Khortytsa. Any ideas?
I think maybe in the tens of thousands.
Yeah, it would be it's now a suburb of Zaporizhia. Would have had thousands of people. Most of the Mennonites, and then 402 Jews, and probably because there were factories in the areas and there was housing built for workers, there would have been a considerable number of Ukrainians by then as well.
Yeah, so in that place there's a majority Ukrainians, and then the Mennonite population, the village had originally been Mennonite. Then we will see the influx with sort of industrialization of other groups, Ukrainians, Jews. There was a synagogue in Khortytsa. Now, we don't know this through Jewish sources. We know this only through Mennonite sources, that this synagogue was there. And I haven't been able to find anything in the Zaporizhia archives about the synagogue in Khortytsa. But according to Mennonites, there was a synagogue there to serve the Jewish population that will then grow in the early Soviet period as people come in. So initially in like the Tsarist period, the population is pretty stable. Then we get into the late Tsarist period where they're starting to do industrialization and there's more people moving in. And then by the Soviet period, you have a lot more mobility and you'll have a lot more Jews from the countryside moving into the bigger city of Zaporizhia and also moving into Khortytsa. And so that's kind of the demographic reflection of the city.
So just on this very point, my name is Daniel Klass, not classy, but my family is from Khortytsa. And one point that I think is important to recognize is that the island of Khortytsa was also the spiritual home, in a sense, of the Cossacks. And so, quite fortunately, based on your reports, my family left in 1913 because of the huge pressure of the anti-Semitic pogroms in that region. And so what was a thriving Jewish community in Khortytsa, which had at that time very good relations between the Mennonites and the Jews, many of the Jews left because of the pogroms stimulated by the Cossacks.
Yeah, there was a considered pogrom in Zaporizhia that took place where a lot of Jewish businesses were destroyed and other violence committed against Jews in the late imperial period when anti-Semitism was quite high in the Russian Empire.
I have a gentleman over there, just 1 second.
My name's Don Peters. Thank you very much for delivering these papers. I've heard the story of Mennonite people in that part of the world and their migration here. And I've heard it as a very sad, tragic story that connects with families that I know and so on. And I have to say that I've never heard this story that you told us today. So I have to wonder, where on earth have I been as a Mennonite not knowing these things? Or I'm wondering why you as historians are coming up with this now. Like, why has it taken so long? What has led to the telling of this history now? Was it known before and not told? Or is there some research that's happened recently that has brought this to light?
I certainly can't answer all of that, but I note from your comment that, in Holocaust studies, there is, of course, a gap as well. That right after the war, people, historians, Jewish historians will say, well, they wanted to get on with life. That was then, and now we got to make a new life, and so it wasn't talked about until somewhat later. There's a little bit of that dynamic here as well. That this is just people weren't very willing to talk about it, and you got to get on with life, and so it wasn't part of the story. It's also not a good story, in the sense that it's not glorification history by any stretch of the imagination, and so it's harder to tell, and one doesn't do it willingly. I mean, even coming here is nerve-wracking because it's not an easy story to tell. It's a difficult story to tell. So that explains it in part.
I can speak a little bit to my own personal journey to this story, and it started at University of Alberta where I did my PhD, and John Paul Himka has been very active in looking at the Ukrainian story and the Ukrainian participation in the perpetration of the Holocaust, and he encouraged us to think about the dynamics of what happened in Ukraine. And so because the Mennonite story is based in Ukraine, the Ukrainian story has really only come to light in probably the last 15, 20 years of what took place. Everyone focused on Germany, focused on Poland, but Ukraine was sort of had a substantial Jewish population and hadn't been fully explored. So as scholars moved into exploring Ukraine, obviously the story of the Mennonites had to follow in some regard underneath that umbrella. Most people have focused on what happened, the actions of Ukrainians, but obviously in these specific areas where there is a significant Mennonite population and ethnic German population, their story has also been told, is starting to be told more and more. And for me, the ability to use different records other than memoirs is essential to this, because memoirs tell you very little about what's going on, and the access to interrogation records of the Soviets after World War II are a good source for figuring out what happened, in addition to German sources that you can then put together, and then you can see where there's where they tell the story, the same type of story. And so that's been really essential in this process.
What was the relationship between the Mennonites and the Jews in these communities before the war, before the German invasion? And were there many collaborators among the Jews with the Stalinist regime? I know there were some Jewish police and the secret police who were not only anti-whatever religion, they were anti-Jewish, anti-rabbi, anti-Zionist, anti-Jewish nationalist. Yeah. So were there any people like that in those communities?
Yes, and so this is part of my research is going to be focusing on Hortitz as a specific place, as a place in which we can follow these multi-ethnic links and see how people reacted and what people did during this period of time, not only during this, but from the start, and also through the 1930s. So I've been working with some files from the 1930s from KGB that has recently been opened in Ukraine. And yes, there were some Jews in the secret police. There were Ukrainians in the secret police. There was also, once again, a multi-ethnic group that targeted people during the 1930s, and once again were implementing a plan that came from elsewhere, right? That came from Moscow and what you were supposed to do. And in that plan, Mennonites did suffer. There were significant arrests of ethnic Germans, along with Ukrainians and other groups. But I really appreciate your point about sort of the experience of the religious community, the Jewish religious community, because I think there are a lot of parallels here that haven't been unpacked with what happened to the Mennonite religious community. Because religion in general under the Soviet regime was deemed, was looked down upon. And you will see secular Jews attacking the religious communities in the 1930s under Stalin, and you will also see some secular Mennonites attacking their own religion. It's the insiders that always have the best points to be made against their religious communities, that are always sort of have the poignant attacks that take place. And so I think that there's a lot to be uncovered by putting these stories together of how religious communities, whether they were Jewish or Mennonite or Ukrainian, experienced this period of the 1930s. So there's a lot more to think about when we start to look at sources together and not just look exclusively at our own source material and start to bring them into a conversation with each other. And the Mennonite-Jewish relations before this, as far as I can tell, they were relatively good, but I think that there needs to be more to be done. For instance, Mennonites will talk about how during the Civil War they would go extinguish candles in the synagogue because there was a candle ration and they were brought in to go and do that task. There was a Jewish bakery, there was a tailor shop that Mennonites would frequent, a grocery store. They were neighbors. There was some intermarriage, too, that would take place more during the Soviet period than during the imperial period. So that's a generalization. There's still a lot of work to be done, but that's an interesting question of what's the dynamic of these relations, and then how did they change with German occupation?
Just one further comment. I think it's fair to say that Mennonites were susceptible to the Nazi propaganda that said Bolshevism is a Jewish plot. The period of time during the 1930s, communication with the outside world was pretty much cut off in Stalinist Russia. So Mennonites probably didn't know a lot. Anna Suderman in her memoirs talks about this, that they even sort of thought, if Soviet propaganda says that the Germans are bad, well, then they must be good, because that's how propaganda worked. So there's this sense. So they were really susceptible to because of, there were some of the people they saw who were avid Bolsheviks, they knew to be Jewish. And so they were susceptible to propaganda like that would construct this as a Jewish plot. I think that's probably fair to say.
Let me just throw in something else on that the Soviet state, in its period of great purges, targeted ethnic Germans clearly in the late 30s, and Mennonites were often seen as ethnic Germans who therefore were arrested, sent to the gulags, and generally mistreated. In a similar way, the Jews were targeted in the late 40s by the Stalinist government, and the purge was not as far-reaching at that point, but there were clear periods of ethnic state action against ethnicities. The Mennonites shortly before the Second World War, the Jews shortly after, the Poles at various times, the Koreans in the Far East at various times. So the Mennonites would have had this in Ukraine and elsewhere, would have been very much aware of this. Fair enough?
And my name is Ben Bader. I'm in history at the University of Manitoba. And first of all, I wanted to thank you for coming out here and presenting your research. And I particularly appreciate your comment that it's a little nerve-wracking. And I wanted to ask a little more about whether you can talk a little more about the context. So I understand that this is work you have initially presented in an academic conference. And is this the first time here in Winnipeg? And it's of course poignant that this would be in a Jewish context, but it's also obvious that there's quite some Mennonite presence here. Have you presented this in a Mennonite context here in Winnipeg too? Are you going to do so? What conversation is happening in the Mennonite community in relation to your work?
I think it's probably fair to say that, you know, a certain book by a fellow by the name of Ben Gosen has triggered a kind of a renewal of the conversation. It's controversial. It's controversial in Mennonite circles, and I won't go into the details of the book and you know get into a long discussion of that alone. But I think that to some extent has triggered the conversation. The papers, both of these papers were given at Bethel College at the conference there. This is the first time I'm giving it in Manitoba, and I think Ilene is in the same position. So there is, I think, right now a fairly active conversation about this in Mennonite circles, although not, you know, I haven't participated in it particularly, but that's, I think, part of the reason. That it, you know, and you know, maybe there's another generation now that is asking questions about their parents and grandparents that haven't been asked before. That, you know, and so, you know, generations are like that. They sometimes they won't want to find out what happened.
Are there any more questions? I think we could take one more if there is one.
I can't help but comment on the fact that in the Ukraine, in that particular part of the Ukraine, where history was really dreadful and painful for many ethnic groups, the conjunction of the same ethnic mix in the city of Winnipeg is rather remarkable. Because although I know from my youth, and even my parents' youth, that there were stories of fights in the North End between Ukrainians and Jews, and that kind of rough relationship. But at the present time, it seems to me that relationships amongst Ukrainians, my best man at my wedding was a Ukrainian. I played golf regularly with an elderly Mennonite gentleman whose wife also came from Korditsa, and we kind of celebrate our common history without rancor, still knowing that there was this terrible episode many years ago. So I think that this is a lovely event. I think that it should be cherished. I think we should continue to discuss these things in a civilized way, trying to understand the nature of the human beast, and perhaps make certain that this area remains an example of how people can get together rather than killing each other.
Thank you, and thanks to both of you again. This was just such a tremendous experience for all of us, I'm sure. I'd like to invite you to have refreshments at the back of the room, and if you then think of some more questions, I'm sure that you can ask Dr. Freezin and Dr. Werner. Thank you so much.